Buju anin Nadijni Kash Banashi Wababiji Dodam Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. Wanted to speak about the identity issue that Native Americans, Indigenous, and First Nations people face in this country, here in the United States, and also in Canada and South America too, right? But mainly here in the United States. And I want to speak about why that's important, and why it's an issue, and why it needs to be addressed, and why it's not, and why it continues to not be addressed or handled with forethought. So the identity issue is this issue of internal and external stereotypes, judgments, and beliefs that determine what we as Native people determine who is part of our culture, our communities. Also, that carries over into the non-Native groups, and suddenly a quantum is the most important argument to most people when they go around speaking about their Indigenous culture, First Nation culture, or Native American culture and roots. And that's the first problem, right? So in order to understand the identity issue, it takes a step back to understand the historic aspect and influence that it has on the current issue today. So let's put some things in perspective. We all have to remember that until 1933, the U.S. government had a plan of extermination for Native Americans. I always tell people that Google is your best friend. Hey, and you can Google all this. There are actual legal government documented forms that prove and show this. And then on top of that, we need to think historical perspective and context as far as treaties, how none have ever been honored by the U.S. government throughout the history of the nation, right? Not one. Also, the idea about reservations, this idea that we were rewarded a reservation. That's not how it went. Hey, usually we were relocated to an area hand selected by either the government or an agent of the government or an actor, right? And we didn't have the science that they have now, so sometimes when they found out that a natural resource was there where they had put us, we'd be relocated once again and exploited in the name of natural resources. 1924, we were considered citizens, but we were still restricted to reservations. And even today, let me back up. Prior to 1978, being on a reservation was very similar to being at a POW camp. We could only leave the reservation with a signed permission slip from a BIA agent, and those BIA agents were usually non-natives. So then the boarding school thing happened, right? During the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Okay? So that we all have to take that into perspective as well, right? And remember that and understand that that was a part of the history. And then we also have to understand that after World War II, this thing called urban development occurred across the country. And urban development is when We plan suburban areas, cities, interurban areas, parks, suburbs, right? Homes. The businesses that are going to go into those homes and tax revenue and things like that, utilities, which include water and sewer and electricity. A lot of those things that we take for granted today that we're privileged to have. But after 1945, reservations were left off of those city development plans. So today, many of our First Nation, Native American, Indigenous nations west of the Mississippi, and even some east, do not have access to clean drinking water, to sewer, or electricity, because it was never in the plan for them, right? All purposely done, right? It was mindful. It was done with thought, okay? They wanted to eliminate us so they don't have to honor any of these treaties. So, because of all that historical trauma, just from the foundation of this country, and that's just a brief list of things. I could go on, right? So I suggest many of you should probably read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. It's a great book. Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, another great book, to help put some more historical perspective and other policies and things that were in place. I'm trying to do this video within 15 to 20 minutes so I don't lose people's interest. And if I sat here and listed everything, it would take more than 15 to 20 minutes. So those are the big shot things. So due to the boarding schools and governmental and federal policy, during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Native women were forcefully sterilized without either their knowledge or consent in order to further whitewash and diminish our numbers. So, high estimate. From North America to South America, it is estimated high-end 120 million Native Americans were murdered or killed due to cultural genocide, assimilation and imperialism, or colonization. Of that number, 250,000 labeled natives survived, and people like me today and other natives, we are direct ancestors of those 255,000 that did survive assimilation, colonization, and murder and genocide. So, how does that lead into the identity issue? Well, we kind of set up the steps for it. So, because of all that during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a lot of shame with being Native. And remember, up until 1978, it was basically illegal to be Native American in the United States of America. So basically, we weren't allowed to practice our cultural beliefs, speak our native tongues, have powwows. We weren't able to be Native. Hey, we weren't able to hit the Dewagan, interact with our Powagans. We did all these ceremonies and things in secret. So the culture did stay alive. But we lost many because of that shame in the boarding schools. I often tell people like John Trudell, I think that the drunk Indian saved my people and our culture. And there's a reason that he did that. One, they didn't want to conform and bow down and be what dominant society told them that they had to be. But at the same time, they didn't want to be Native publicly. And they just wanted to be. So the booze, when they got geeshed out or drunk, often helped them deal with those, that guilt, that trauma, that pain, that hurt, that lost identity. So, after 1978, those of us born after that, I will say those 75 and on, we are the first generation where it wasn't illegal to be Indian. So, all this is new to all of us. We're all learning as we go. But it was that drunk generation, that drunk Indian that did save our culture. And again, he didn't want to be what dominant society told him he had to be. He just wanted to be. And because of that, a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the cultural teachings were still said and hid inside of them. And when they did sober up, they came back to our people. Or the teaching still went on and those people came back to the circle, which is important. So the identity issue today, we still deal with the shame. We still deal with the issue of many natives. I know many, especially in my community in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that think that one must have an Indian card in order to be native. That's false. So from a decolonization perspective, many elders will tell you that only the sellouts were the ones that enrolled with the tribes because they knew they were Indian. They didn't need the government's approval to be Indian. And I know many that are like that, especially up in Sault Ste. Marie, Bay Mills, Petoskey, Traverse City area. There's also this notion about quantum. So people believe that quantum makes one more Indian than another. And I'm going to tell you right now that being a native or an Indian, indigenous, or a First Nation is all about what's in your O'Day, your heart. And that descendants do have a role in our culture. And that's because of the planned termination and extinction that the U.S. government had employed. So we have to honor those descendants. And those descendants have just as much right to those that circle, that Dawagan, that Pawagan, as a full blood or a quarter blood or a half blood or a 3/8 blood or anything. They have just as much right and say to those places and those spaces as any of you that have a federal Indian card like I do. Why is this an issue? Many natives today are inner urban natives. So that means that they live within big metropolitan areas. And just from my experience, and I'm sure most of you have experienced too, that most people think that we as natives are relics or we're walking proofs of history. And while that may be true, we are still here. We're still a strong people. I think there's over like 3.5 million people that are registered or identify as native. That doesn't mean that's all of them, right? That's the issue I'm trying to push here. That number's way bigger. A lot of people may not know that they're native, or maybe they're a quarter blood and they don't think that they're native enough. Maybe they're an eighth blood, they don't think they're native enough, or they're a direct descendant of that plan, right? And if you don't believe in that plan, all you have to do is look up at the Cherokee people's history and look at the way that their Ogamas, their chiefs, all morphed and changed throughout history, and why the government and the whites infiltrated that tribe, and how much territory, power, and pull that the Cherokee once had that they lost, and the government knew that they had that, so they infiltrated it. And it's the same in our people, right? I'm not as dark as my grandfather, who was a full-blood, is, right? I'm pretty light-skinned. And that's also due to our environment. So this notion of you don't look Indian enough, I don't have a quiver on, arrow quiver all the time, or I don't have a feather because my skin's lighter, right? Or somebody with the notion of that they're a half-blood, so they're more native and more Indian spirit and all that than an eighth blood, is all false, right? It's perpetuating colonialism. That's what it is. Why is that a big issue? Well, it's a big issue because a lot of our prophecies from a traditional aspect talk about the rainbow people. They also talk about, due to assimilation and things like that, that one drop of Indian blood makes you Indian, right? And when we think about that, we should apply, when we apply that concept to black people or Mexican people, we never say, hey, you're only a half black person, or you're only a half Mexican, or any of this. It's only our people that people do this to, and we do it eternally, and it's done to us externally, right? I always tell people that nobody owns the oppression Olympics like Native people, because somehow, in some way, we always make it as though oppression is some kind of Olympic sport. And when it comes to lateral oppression, nobody owns it more than we do. Okay? And that's a fact. Right? So, that identity issue. When I bring this up, it's important that, to me, as being growing up half somewhat traditionally, being in tribal foster care and learning a lot of these things as a youngster and then coming back to them later in my life, I often had a lost sense of who I was and where I belonged. And because of that, I drank a lot. I did drugs, gangbanged. I did a lot of stupid things in order to try and be somebody. Well, then I got my name and my clan. And I felt that sensation that I knew where I was supposed to be and that I belonged somewhere and I was somebody, right? Like to see your lineage, to see the historical proof that your people were in this area for so many decades and millennia, and to have that spiritual awakening or that sense of urgency that you are now a part of something, led to my sobriety. It led to my education. It also led to me to quit trying to off myself, committing suicide. Plus all the trauma I dealt with as a child helped subdue some of that. But I know what it's like to feel like a child, like nobody cares. So it's important to me that this identity issue is not only preached about, taught, and awareness raised. It's because nobody, no child, no person, especially Anishinaabe, First Nation, Indigenous, or Native American, should ever feel like they don't have a place in this world, because you do. Hey, it was foretold, it was said that you were going to be here. You are a direct descendant of your ancestors, and your ancestors were mighty. But there's so many other things that go into this identity issue that maybe I can touch on another video. Things like education, ceremonies, tradition, teachings, what it's like to be Anishinaabe today. But the main thing is that we provide that space so that those that are new, that are trying to learn or want to be a part of the culture, we provide that space and opportunity for them to come in and do that without judgment. Hey? Without you pulling an Indian card and saying, oh, I'm a half-breed and I know this and I know that and blah, blah, blah. My skin's darker. That doesn't help the identity issue. Hey? The identity issue right now is we need positive male role models in the community. Let's address the illiteracy issue and the rate that's high in the Native community. Let's address diabetes. Let's address alcoholism and substance abuse. Let's address our missing and murdered and missing Indigenous women. Hey, let's bring back the teaching of the Two-Spirit people and the teaching of women, right? Those identity issues are important. Everybody should know that they come from somewhere and that they belong to something, right? Our clans and our names, they give us that. Hey, the community, no matter how small and personal differences that you may have with others, it's unlike any other community, right? A white man can go to a social event and have beef, go to other social events and never have to worry about seeing those other white people that he had the beef with before. You can't do that as a Native. Hey, our circle is small. I have beef with many people, but I still have to go to events. I still have to do these things, right? And no matter what, because I belong there. That's my space. Those are my people. It's my culture. I have a right to it. And so do those people, whether they have a federal card or not. Right? So this notion of us, always somebody has to have a federally enrolled card. It's perpetuating colonialism. And that's part of the bigger issue that we face with the identity issue crisis. And until tribes and people understand this, and those that they employ understand it, it's going to be a constant issue. So I made it under 20 minutes. Woo! I'll post another video next week. Thank you for listening. Bamapi.